Commander David Reyes stepped off the transport ship and into the towering halls of Orionis Interstellar Academy, feeling the eyes of dozens of alien instructors and students on him. His footsteps echoed in the pristine corridors, a subtle reminder that everything about this place was designed to impress and to intimidate. The Academy was renowned as the finest institution in the galaxy, responsible for shaping future leaders from dozens of species. And now, for the first time in its long history, it had accepted a human onto its faculty. David stood still for a moment, adjusting the strap of his duffel bag and exhaling slowly. The Academy's glass walls overlooked a breathtaking view of the nearby gas giant, its swirling clouds glowing against the backdrop of stars. But the beauty of it barely registered. He knew what was waiting for him: skepticism. The idea of a human instructor here had been met with scorn from both students and staff. Orionis didn't have time for amateurs, and many believed that a human, especially a retired astronaut from a lesser-developed planet like Earth, was nothing more than an experiment doomed to fail. An attendant led him down the main corridor toward the faculty wing. The Academy was bustling with students and instructors of all shapes and sizes: tall, feathered avians from the Skelton system, crystalline beings whose glowing forms shimmered with every movement, and reptilian elvars with rows of sharp teeth. They eyed David curiously as he passed, their expressions a mix of amusement, curiosity, and disdain. He had encountered the same looks before during his years in space, but it still stung to know they expected him to fail before he had even begun. He reached his new office, which felt cold and impersonal: bare walls, a standard-issue desk, and a chair that looked more uncomfortable than supportive. There was a small stack of data pads on the desk, filled with course materials and guidelines for instructors, but David already knew he wouldn't be sticking to the traditional curriculum. The head faculty had explained the Academy's rigid standards during his onboarding, but David had never been one to do things by the book. He believed that leadership wasn't about memorizing protocols. It was about making tough calls when things went wrong and inspiring others when hope ran out. Time to shake things up, he muttered to himself, tossing his bag onto the chair. His first class was scheduled for the following morning, but David wanted to get a feel for the students before then. He took a walk through the Academy's central atrium, where students gathered between lectures. Conversations buzzed in multiple languages, some sharp and melodic, others harsh and guttural. David's translator implant worked overtime, catching snippets of conversations about upcoming assignments, competitions, and old rivalries. It didn't take long for him to hear his name. "Did you hear about the new instructor? The human?" a Skelton student whispered to her friends, her feathers ruffling in amusement. "I bet he won't last a month," a crystalline student hummed in agreement, their glowing form pulsing faintly. "Humans are too emotional. They'll never understand how to train future leaders." David grinned to himself but kept walking. He knew better than to take it personally. This was the way things worked in elite spaces. Newcomers were tested, and if they didn't prove themselves quickly, they were cast aside. He had faced challenges like this before. In space, respect wasn't given, it was earned. The next morning, David walked into his first class ready for anything. The lecture hall was enormous, with rows of seats filled by students from dozens of species. Their expressions ranged from mild curiosity to outright boredom. A few whispered among themselves as David set up the projector, no doubt questioning whether he was qualified to teach them. He ignored the whispers and tapped the screen, bringing up his lesson plan. "Good morning," David began, his voice calm and steady. "My name is Commander David Reyes, and I'll be your instructor for leadership fundamentals." There was no reaction. A few students leaned back in their seats, arms crossed, waiting for him to fail. "Before we dive into the lesson," David continued, "I want to tell you a story." The room went still. This was not the standard introduction they were used to, and that at least caught their attention. "Years ago, I was part of a crew exploring the far side of our solar system," David said. "We lost contact with Earth during a storm, and the ship's life support systems were compromised. We had 3 days' worth of oxygen left, and no guarantee of rescue. Everyone was looking to me, the mission commander, to make the call." He paused, letting the silence stretch. Some students leaned forward slightly, intrigued despite themselves. "What do you think I did?" David asked, scanning the room. A reptilian student near the back scoffed. "You probably panicked. Most humans do under pressure." David smiled. "That's what everyone thinks. But instead of panicking, I sat down with my crew. We mapped out every possible solution, no matter how ridiculous, and eventually we figured it out. We used the ship's waste heat to power a short-range distress signal. It worked. We were rescued with a few hours to spare." He leaned forward, his gaze sweeping the room. The point is, leadership isn't about knowing all the answers. It's about staying calm when things go wrong and trusting your team to find solutions you wouldn't think of on your own. The students shifted in their seats, some clearly unimpressed, others reconsidering their initial assumptions. David knew he hadn't won them over yet, but that was fine. He wasn't here to impress them with fancy titles or elaborate theories. He was here to show them what leadership looked like in the real world. The rest of the class passed uneventfully. David introduced some of the course material, though he knew he'd be adding his own spin to it in the coming weeks. A few students asked questions. Most were polite, but he noticed the skepticism in their voices. It was the same doubt he had heard throughout his career. What does a human know about surviving in space? When the class ended, the students filed out quickly, eager to move on to more familiar subjects. David stayed behind, gathering his notes. As he packed up, a tall, feathered student, the same skeleton who had whispered about him in the atrium, paused by the door. "You'll need more than stories to survive here, Commander," she said, her voice half teasing, half challenging. David gave her a small, knowing smile. "Good thing I've got plenty of stories then." The skeleton snorted softly and left without another word. Alone in the empty classroom, David sat back in his chair and exhaled slowly. His first day hadn't been perfect, but it was a start. He had learned long ago that progress didn't happen overnight. It took time, effort, and a whole lot of patience. As he locked up the lecture hall and made his way back to his office, David reminded himself why he was here. He wasn't just teaching leadership. He was here to show these students that leadership was about heart, about empathy, and about learning to trust the people around you, no matter where they came from. And if they weren't ready to listen yet, well, he had plenty more stories to tell. This was just the beginning. David Reyes arrived early for his second day at the academy, determined to approach his class with more patience and flexibility. His first day had been rocky, but he knew better than to let that discourage him. He'd spent decades in space, navigating unpredictable situations, surviving mechanical failures, and working with difficult crews. Winning over a classroom of skeptical students would take more than a few lectures. It would take persistence. As the students trickled into the lecture hall, David noticed the subtle dynamics between them. Some groups stuck to their own species, feathered skelthans flocking together, crystalline Frendalians sitting close to one another. Others clustered by reputation, with the most confident students already establishing themselves as the unofficial leaders. The one thing they all seemed to agree on, however, was that their human instructor didn't deserve to be here. David stood at the front of the room, arms crossed, observing his students with the quiet patience of someone used to waiting out storms. Once everyone had settled, or as close to settled as they were going to get, he tapped the console to begin class. "Today," David announced, "we're going to skip the lecture." That caught their attention. A ripple of confusion spread through the room. The students exchanged glances, their skepticism thick in the air. "We'll be doing something a little different," David continued. "Leadership isn't learned by sitting in chairs. It's learned through experience." He waved his hand, and the classroom's lights dimmed. The walls shimmered as the room transformed into a holographic simulation. They now stood on the surface of a barren alien planet, complete with jagged cliffs and swirling, dusty winds. The students looked around, surprised and intrigued. "This," David said, gesturing to the simulated landscape, "is the scenario. Your objective is simple. Your team must reach the extraction point on the other side of the ridge within 1 hour." He smiled. "But there's a catch. You only succeed if your entire team makes it to the other side." A crystal-like student from the back row, her form flickering with frustration, raised a hand. "This is pointless. How does running around in a simulation teach leadership?" David gave her a patient look. "You'll find out soon enough. Now, I'll be observing but not interfering. The clock starts now." The students hesitated at first, exchanging uncertain glances. Then, as the timer appeared above the ridge, they scrambled into action, organizing themselves into groups based on familiarity or strength. Predictably, chaos followed. The more aggressive students, like Virek, a large reptilian Elvar with an air of superiority, immediately took charge. He barked orders, insisting on leading the fastest group to scout ahead, leaving weaker members behind. Meanwhile, a smaller team led by the skeleton named Tali attempted to take a more careful approach, but their caution slowed them down. A few loners, deciding they didn't need a team at all, broke off on their own to try their luck. David watched silently from the edge of the simulation, arms folded. This was exactly what he'd expected. Most students believed leadership was about taking control, issuing orders and expecting obedience. They hadn't yet learned the most valuable lesson of all. Leadership was about people. Not long into the exercise, things started going wrong. The faster group, led by Virek, reached an unstable part of the ridge. The ground cracked beneath their feet, sending 2 students tumbling down into a steep ravine. Virek cursed but refused to turn back. "Leave them. We have to reach the objective." Tali's group ran into trouble too. One of their members got caught in a sinkhole, and the group spent precious minutes arguing about whether to stop and help. Time ticked away, and frustration began to boil over. "Come on!" Tali shouted, flaring her feathers in irritation. "We need to move faster, or we'll miss the extraction." "This is a waste of time," muttered a crystalline student glowing dimly with annoyance. "Why should we carry someone who can't keep up?" David watched it all unfold without a word. He resisted the urge to step in, letting the students struggle through the exercise on their own. These early failures were important. Essential even. They needed to learn that success wasn't just about reaching the finish line. It was about how they got there, and who they brought with them. With only 15 minutes left, most of the groups were scattered across the simulation, some trapped in dead ends, others split up and bickering among themselves. David tapped a button on his console, causing the simulated environment to grow more hostile. Dust storms whipped through the landscape, and the temperature began to plummet. "This isn't fair," one student shouted over the simulated winds. "Neither is space," David muttered under his breath. Finally, the groups began to realize they couldn't reach the goal alone. Tali's team doubled back to help the students trapped in the ravine, though the effort cost them valuable time. Virek reluctantly admitted they couldn't make it without coordinating with the other groups. They started working together, patching together a plan on the fly, with each group contributing something: strength, strategy, or specialized skills. In the end, the students reached the extraction point with only seconds to spare, dragging each other across the finish line, exhausted but victorious. David ended the simulation with a tap, returning the room to its original form. The students sat panting in their seats, disheveled and visibly irritated. Virek looked especially annoyed, muttering under his breath about how the exercise had been unfair. "Good job," David said, standing in front of them with a calm expression. "You figured it out, eventually." Tali, still catching her breath, raised a hand. "What exactly was the point of that?" David smiled, but there was no smugness in it. "The point is, leadership isn't about crossing the finish line first. It's about getting everyone there, together." Virek scowled. "But we wasted time helping the weak ones. If we hadn't, we could have finished faster." David's gaze hardened, though his tone remained steady. "And if this had been real, those weak ones would have died. What kind of leader are you if you leave people behind?" The room fell silent. Some students looked uncomfortable, while others stared down at their hands, lost in thought. They had expected leadership to be about winning, about showing dominance and control. David had shown them it was about responsibility, about looking out for the people around you, even when it was inconvenient or difficult. Tali was the first to break the silence. "So, leadership is about teamwork?" she asked, frowning slightly, as if the idea felt foreign to her. David nodded. "Leadership is about recognizing that no one can do everything alone. It's about knowing when to step up and when to step back and let others take the lead." For a moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, a few students began to nod. Even Virek, grudgingly, seemed to accept the lesson, though his expression remained sour. "Class dismissed," David said, gathering his things. "Same time tomorrow. And next time, come prepared to fail. It's part of the process." As the students filed out of the room, David noticed Tali linger for a moment, giving him an appraising look. "Not bad for a human," she said with a flick of her feathers before leaving. David chuckled to himself, feeling a small spark of satisfaction. He knew he still had a long way to go before winning over the entire class, but this was progress. For the first time, the students had seen that there was more to leadership than they had thought, and little by little, David was starting to show them what it really meant to lead, not just with knowledge, but with heart. David Reyes arrived in the classroom the following week, finding his students already seated and exchanging hushed conversations. Something had shifted since the last session. The students weren't just tolerating his lessons anymore, they were beginning to engage with them. Even Virek, the proud Elvar who had resisted David's authority at every turn, sat at attention, though his posture still radiated stubbornness. David smiled inwardly. He knew better than to celebrate too early, but it was clear the students were starting to see value in his methods. Still, the hardest part of leadership wasn't teaching teamwork or problem solving, it was trust, and that was where today's lesson would take them. "All right, listen up," David said, clapping his hands. The room quieted instantly. "Today's exercise is about making decisions under pressure and trusting others to do their part, even when you can't control every detail." That got a few raised eyebrows. Trust was a delicate concept in a place like Orionis Academy. Here, students came from different species, each with their own values, expectations, and instincts. Trust was hard to earn, and even harder to extend to someone from a rival species. David tapped the console, and the room shimmered as it transformed into a new simulation. This time, they found themselves on the bridge of a damaged starship. Warning lights flashed red, and sirens blared, filling the air with a sense of urgency. The holographic windows showed stars streaking past. This ship was speeding toward a dangerous gravitational anomaly. "Here's the scenario," David explained. "Your ship has sustained critical damage. The engines are failing, your navigation system is malfunctioning, and you have 20 minutes before you're pulled into the gravity well of a collapsing star." He paced along the front of the room, arms crossed. "Your mission is to escape with as many crew members as possible, but to do that, you'll need to make decisions and trust each other to carry them out." The students exchanged uneasy glances. David knew this was going to be a challenge. Trust wasn't just about strategy or skill, it was about vulnerability. It required students to admit they couldn't do everything on their own. "I'll be assigning roles," David continued, scrolling through his datapad. "Each of you will take responsibility for a specific system: navigation, engineering, life support, and communications. You'll have to coordinate your efforts to stabilize the ship." The students groaned quietly, and David suppressed a grin. The roles weren't designed to suit their natural strengths. Virek, who thrived on direct action, was assigned to communications, a job requiring patience and precision. Tali, who preferred to plan meticulously, was given the chaotic task of engineering. David had intentionally mismatched their assignments. He wanted to see how they handled situations where their instincts wouldn't help them. "Remember," David said, his tone serious, "the only way you succeed is by working together, and that means trusting each other, even when things go wrong." He tapped the console, and the countdown clock appeared on the wall. 2000 hours. The simulation began in earnest. Tali rushed to the engineering console, her feathers ruffling in frustration as she tried to make sense of the unfamiliar systems. "I've got coolant leaks in 3 sections. If I don't patch them, the engines are going to overheat." Meanwhile, Virek grumbled at the communication station. "Why am I stuck with this nonsense? Someone else can handle comms. Just tell me what needs breaking." "Stay at your station, Virek," David said, his voice firm. "You've got incoming messages from an emergency rescue ship. If you miss them, the crew won't make it out in time." Virek cursed under his breath but obeyed, his claws clacking irritably against the console as he decoded garbled transmissions. 1845. The room buzzed with frantic activity. A crystalline student named Farron took control of navigation, plotting escape routes while monitoring the ship's trajectory. "We're drifting off course," Farron called out. "If we don't correct in the next 5 minutes, we'll be too close to the star to escape." Tali groaned from engineering. "I'm working on it, but I need time." David stood at the edge of the simulation, silently observing. He knew the students would struggle, and that was the point. Leadership wasn't about having perfect answers. It was about making tough decisions in imperfect situations. 1710. The tension in the room grew as the simulation threw more obstacles their way. Panels exploded in sparks, systems failed without warning, and false alarms triggered chaos. "Tali, I need those engines stabilized," Farron shouted, his crystal form glowing brighter with frustration. "I know," Tali snapped back, "but the pressure valves are shot. I need someone to reroute power from life support." Virek sneered from the communications station. "What's the matter? Can't handle a little pressure?" "Shut up, Virek," Tali shot back, her feathers bristling. "I could use some actual help right now." David watched the argument unfold, resisting the urge to intervene. It was tempting to step in, but this was part of the exercise. They needed to figure out how to trust each other, and fast. 1500. The countdown clock continued its relentless march toward zero. Farron, sensing the urgency, made the first leap of trust. "Virek, reroute the life support systems. If we lose a few non-critical areas, we'll buy time for the engines." Virek hesitated, clearly torn between his disdain for the task and the pressure of the moment. But after a brief pause, he grumbled and got to work. "Fine, but if this kills us, it's on you." The student started to find a rhythm, clumsy and imperfect, but functional. Tali managed to patch the coolant leaks just as Farron adjusted the ship's course, steering them away from the worst of the gravitational pull. 10:30. The simulated ship groaned under the strain, its hull vibrating ominously. Virek finally decoded the incoming transmissions, relaying instructions from the rescue ship. "They've sent a beacon," Virek said, his tone grudgingly serious. "If we sync our nav system with theirs, we'll get an escape vector." "Do it!" Farron barked, his glowing form flickering under the stress. Virek entered the coordinates, his usual arrogance replaced by grim focus. For the first time, David saw a flicker of respect between the students. 6:45. The final moments of the simulation were pure chaos. Systems flickered in and out, alarms wailed, and the ship groaned under the stress of escape velocity. But the students held their ground, trusting each other's decisions and working as a team. At the last possible second, the ship burst free from the star's gravity well, rocketing toward safety. 002, 001, 00. The room reverted to normal as the simulation ended, leaving the students panting and disheveled but victorious. David clapped his hands slowly, a satisfied grin on his face. "Well done," he said. "Not perfect, but you made it." Tali slumped into her seat, exhausted. "That was brutal." Virek crossed his arms, though there was a flicker of grudging respect in his expression. "I still think I could have broken something to make it work faster." David chuckled. "Maybe, but breaking things isn't always the answer, Virek. Sometimes leadership means trusting others to do their jobs, even when it feels like things are falling apart." The students exchanged glances, some nodding thoughtfully. They had learned something valuable today, not just about strategy, but about each other. Trust wasn't about control or perfection. It was about letting go, even when it was uncomfortable. As the students filed out of the room, Tali lingered behind, giving David a curious look. "You really don't teach like anyone else," she said, her tone almost admiring. David smiled. "That's kind of the point." Tali gave a small, approving nod before leaving. Alone in the empty classroom, David leaned against his desk, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. They weren't just learning how to lead, they were learning how to trust. And that, more than anything, was what would shape them into real leaders. This was progress. And for the first time since his arrival, David knew he was exactly where he needed to be. David Reyes entered the Academy's bustling central hall, greeted by a cacophony of alien voices. Students of every species moved through the massive atrium, some slithering, others gliding, a few hovering. The Academy's walls shimmered with light, constantly shifting to reflect the surrounding energy fields, a feature meant to inspire focus and creativity. But beneath the colorful energy flows, David noticed something else, an undercurrent of change. The students were talking about him. He caught snippets of conversations as he walked past groups of students, fragments of discussions about his recent simulations, how his classes were different from the norm, and surprisingly, a few positive comments mixed in with the usual skepticism. "He makes us think instead of just memorizing protocols." "Yeah, but humans are weird. Who teaches teamwork by making you fail first?" "He's all right. At least it's never boring." David smiled to himself. He knew change was slow, but this was a step in the right direction. Respect wasn't given at Orionis Academy. It was earned, piece by piece. The fact that students were starting to acknowledge his methods, even grudgingly, meant he was making an impact. Still, not everyone shared the sentiment. As David approached the faculty wing, the familiar sharp voice of Instructor Maltrix stopped him in his tracks. "Reyes," Maltrix called, slithering over with an air of barely concealed irritation. The Drask instructor loomed, his scaled body coiled in tight spirals. "I hear you've been improvising your lessons." David folded his arms. "If by improvising you mean adapting to the students' needs, then yeah." "Guilty as charged." Maltrix's slit-pupiled eyes narrowed. "This academy has centuries of tradition. Structure is what shapes leaders. Your methods," he waved a clawed hand dismissively, "they undermine discipline." David gave a small shrug, unfazed. "If I remember right, leaders also need to think on their feet. That's what I'm teaching. How to handle chaos. Real life doesn't follow protocols, Maltrix." The Drask hissed softly, a sound somewhere between annoyance and warning. "Careful, human. There's only so much room for experimentation before you risk damaging your standing here." David held his ground. He knew he wasn't exactly loved by his fellow instructors, but he didn't care. The students were learning, and that was what mattered. "Thanks for the advice," David said evenly. "I'll keep it in mind." Maltrix's eyes gleamed with unspoken disdain, but the Drask said nothing more as he slithered away. David sighed. Winning over the students was hard enough. Convincing the faculty that his methods worked was going to be an even bigger challenge, but he hadn't come this far to back down now. He still had more to teach and more to prove. Later that week, David found himself preparing for a new class. This time the focus wasn't on tactical maneuvers or teamwork simulations. It was something far more personal. He called it breaking barriers, and it was designed to push the students beyond their comfort zones in a way they wouldn't expect. The students filed in, already familiar with David's habit of surprising them. Tali, Virek, and Farron took their usual seats, each wearing expressions of both curiosity and wariness. "All right," David began, standing in front of the class. Today, we're doing something different. I want each of you to tell me about the hardest challenge you've faced so far, not just in class, but in life. And no, this isn't graded. The room fell silent. The students exchanged puzzled glances, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Virek crossed his arms, a skeptical sneer curling across his reptilian lips. What's the point of this? We're supposed to be training to command fleets, not tell stories. David leaned against his desk, his expression calm but unyielding. Fleet commanders need to understand more than tactics. They need to understand people, and that starts with learning to understand each other. The silence stretched, awkward and heavy, as the students processed his words. Finally, Tali cleared her throat, her feathers ruffling nervously. I'll go first, she said hesitantly. When I was younger, I competed in an engineering tournament on my homeworld. I lost badly. She paused, her eyes downcast. I almost quit engineering after that. It felt like all my work meant nothing. David nodded, his expression encouraging. What made you keep going? Tali shifted in her seat, her feathers fluttering slightly. My mentor told me that failure isn't the end. It's just a step in the process. So I tried again the next year, and I won. David smiled. That's exactly the kind of lesson a leader needs to learn. Thanks for sharing, Tali. The room stayed quiet for a moment, as if the students were processing what they'd just heard. Then, to David's surprise, Farron spoke up. I was the youngest in my hatch, the crystalline student said, his voice soft but steady. Everyone thought I was fragile. They said I'd shatter under pressure. His crystalline form glimmered briefly as he spoke. But I didn't, and now I'm here. David nodded again, impressed by the honesty in Farron's voice. That's resilience, Farron, and resilience is one of the most important qualities a leader can have. David turned his gaze toward Virek, who was slouched in his seat, glaring at the floor. What about you, Virek? The Elvar sneered, baring his fangs. I don't need to share my personal life with anyone. David didn't push, but he held Virek's gaze. Fair enough, he said quietly. But when you're ready, your story could teach someone else how to keep going. Virek scoffed, but there was a flicker of something in his expression, something that told David the Elvar's walls weren't as impenetrable as he pretended. The rest of the session went smoothly, with a few more students stepping forward to share their experiences. Some talked about personal failures. Others spoke of challenges with their families or doubts about their abilities. Little by little, the students began to understand that leadership wasn't about perfection, it was about perseverance. As the class ended, Tali lingered by the door, her expression thoughtful. That was different, she admitted, in a good way. David smiled. It's not always about what you know. Sometimes it's about who you become along the way. Tali nodded slowly, as if the words carried more weight than she had expected. I guess I never thought of it that way. After the students left, David sat at his desk, reviewing his notes. The session had gone better than he'd hoped. The students had begun to open up, to trust him, and maybe even trust each other. But the real test was still ahead. He knew that trust, once built, had to be tested under pressure, and soon, the students would face a challenge that would push them beyond anything they had experienced before. As David prepared for the next phase of their training, a message pinged on his datapad, a reminder that the Academy's annual fleet simulation tournament was fast approaching. David grinned. The tournament would be the perfect stage to see how far his students had come, and it would also be a chance to show the other instructors, including Maltrix, that a human's way of teaching had its own kind of strength. The next challenge was on the horizon, and David was ready for it. His students, they'd be ready too. The day of the fleet simulation tournament arrived, and the Academy buzzed with anticipation. This was the grand event that students trained for all year, a trial designed to test every skill, from tactical thinking to teamwork, diplomacy to crisis management. Winning wasn't just about earning prestige, it was a fast track to leadership roles in the most powerful fleets in the galaxy. David Reyes stood at the edge of the observation platform overlooking the massive simulation arena. Hundreds of students had gathered, their respective teams spread out in preparation for the tournament's challenges. The arena itself was an ever-shifting virtual battlefield, a simulated expanse of asteroid fields, space stations, derelict vessels, and hostile zones. David's students, Tali, Virek, Farron, and a handful of others, stood off to the side, waiting for their chance to prove themselves. Despite the months of progress they had made, they now looked nervous. He saw Tali fidgeting with her datapad, Virek pacing restlessly, and Farron polishing one of his crystalline arms. Relax, David called out, stepping toward them. You've trained for this. Virek rolled his eyes. Training is one thing, Reyes. Winning against some of the top teams in the galaxy is another. David crossed his arms. You think winning is the only thing that matters here? Virek gave him a skeptical look. isn't it? David smiled, but there was steel in his gaze. Winning is nice, sure, but that's not the goal. The goal is to think differently. Adapt. Outmaneuver your opponents by being unpredictable. The students exchanged glances, unsure whether to feel reassured or more anxious. You don't have to be the smartest or the strongest, David continued. You just have to be the most resourceful. And that's what we've been working on from the start. Trust yourselves. Trust each other. Farron tilted his head, his crystalline surface shimmering faintly. And if things go wrong, David gave a crooked grin. They will go wrong. That's guaranteed. The question is, what will you do about it? Tali took a breath, her feathers settling. Virek's tense shoulders eased, just a little. They weren't entirely calm, but they were ready, and that was good enough for David. As the tournament's opening announcement echoed through the arena, the students gathered into their assigned teams. David stepped back toward the observation platform, knowing this was their moment now. They had to solve this on their own, without his direct help. Let's see what you've got, he whispered under his breath. The tournament began with a burst of energy. Dozens of simulated ships appeared in the arena, each assigned to a different student team. The goal was deceptively simple: navigate a series of objectives, rescue stranded vessels, secure trade routes, and negotiate ceasefires, while avoiding traps set by rival teams. Every move was monitored by instructors, each mistake tallied and each victory calculated. Within minutes, the chaos began. Tali's team, like most, focused on trying to complete their objectives as efficiently as possible. But the top teams from the Solarian and Drask academies had already begun playing aggressively, setting traps for weaker teams and forming temporary alliances to dominate key zones. From the observation platform, David watched his students struggle to keep up. Virek's frustrations boiled over when a rival team boxed them into an asteroid field, forcing them to retreat and rethink their strategy. This isn't looking good, murmured one of the other instructors watching beside David. It was Maltrix, the Drask, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Seems your students are out of their depth, Reyes. David didn't respond immediately, his eyes focused on the unfolding simulation. His students were struggling, yes, but that was exactly the point. This wasn't just about tactics. It was about how they handled setbacks. Give it a minute, David said calmly. Down in the arena, Virek slammed a fist against the control panel of their virtual ship. This is impossible. Every time we get ahead, they shut us down. Tali placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice steady. We can't win if we play their game. Farron blinked. What do you mean? We've been reacting to everything they do, Tali explained. We need to stop trying to beat them at their own tactics and start doing something they won't expect. Virek grumbled. And what exactly is that? Tali's eyes sparkled with sudden inspiration. We let them think we've given up. The plan was risky, bordering on reckless, but it was exactly the kind of thinking David had been waiting for. His students abandoned their primary objectives, scattering across the arena in unpredictable directions. Their rivals, sensing an easy win, ignored them, focusing instead on securing high-value targets. But David's students weren't retreating. They were setting a trap of their own. Tali's team began luring rival ships into hidden choke points within asteroid clusters, isolating them one by one. Virek coordinated surprise maneuvers, turning what looked like disorganized chaos into precise ambushes. Farron used his communication skills to sow confusion among the top teams, broadcasting false coordinates and decoy signals. Within 20 minutes, the tide began to turn. From the observation platform, David watched with pride as his students took control of key zones, exploiting every gap and hesitation in their opponents' strategies. The Solarian and Drask teams, confused by the sudden shift in tactics, found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. Even Maltrix, who had been watching with smug amusement, began to shift uncomfortably. What are they doing? He muttered, narrowing his eyes. David smirked. They're improvising. The final moments of the simulation were a blur of frantic maneuvers and last-minute gambles. Tali's team managed to secure a trade route just as the timer ran out, locking in enough points to place them in the top 3. It wasn't a flawless victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. When the simulation ended, the arena erupted into chatter. Some students were stunned by the human-led team's unexpected success. Others were quietly impressed. Even the instructors exchanged uncertain glances. David's students gathered at the edge of the arena, breathless but grinning. "We did it!" Tali exclaimed, her feathers ruffling with excitement. Virek crossed his arms, but there was a rare flicker of pride in his expression. Not bad, Featherbrain. Not bad at all. David descended from the observation platform, clapping his hands as he approached. You all did exactly what I hoped you would. Tali tilted her head. You mean, screw up at the beginning? David laughed. Exactly. And then you adapted. You found your own way through the chaos. Farron gave a small smile. So, this was a test all along? Every challenge is a test, David said, his tone serious but warm. And you passed the most important one. You trusted each other when things got tough. Virek frowned. But we didn't win first place. David shrugged. Winning is nice, but learning to think on your feet is better. Besides, he grinned, this is just the beginning. As the students exchanged glances, some proud, some thoughtful, David saw something shift in their expressions. They had grown, not just as individuals, but as a team. Later, as the academy's hallways emptied and the students dispersed, David stood quietly by the observation window, gazing out at the stars. He knew that his time at Orionis Academy hadn't been easy, but moments like this, when students learned to believe in themselves, made every challenge worth it. He heard a soft voice behind him. You've done well, Reyes. David turned to see Maltrix, the Drask instructor, standing beside him. There was no sneer this time, just a grudging nod of respect. Maybe, David said with a grin, but this is only the first step. Maltrix gave a low hiss, which David chose to interpret as approval. Before slithering away, David smiled to himself. The journey wasn't over. There would always be more challenges, more obstacles to overcome, but for now he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The human way wasn't perfect, but it was good enough, and sometimes that was all it took to change the stars.